There is a particular kind of silence that happens after something unforgivable. Not the silence of an empty room, not the comfortable quiet of a Sunday morning, or the held breath pause before something beautiful begins. This is a different silence altogether. Tight, electric, the kind that presses against the inside of your chest and waits. It's the silence that follows a public humiliation, the silence of a room full of people who saw exactly what happened and are deciding, all at once, whether they witnessed it or not. I know that silence now. I know the precise temperature of it, the exact weight of 47 pairs of eyes turning carefully away from you so they don't have to acknowledge what they just saw. My name is Margaret Lin. I am 67 years old. I was born in San Francisco, raised in Houston, and I have lived in Atlanta for 31 years, long enough to consider it mine, long enough to have buried my husband here, long enough to have built something in this city that most people in that wedding reception hall had absolutely no idea existed. The hand that grabbed my arm belonged to my daughter-in-law, Vivian. She did it in front of everyone. She did it the way people touch things they believe belong to them, without hesitation, without apology, with the casual confidence of someone who has never once considered that they might be wrong. I had been standing near the head table, talking quietly with my son's college roommate, James, whom I had known for 12 years and who had flown in from Seattle specifically to celebrate Daniel's wedding day. We were laughing. James had just told me something funny about the rehearsal dinner speech that got cut, and I had my hand on his arm, the way you do when someone makes you laugh and you need somewhere to put the warmth of it. That's when Vivian appeared beside me. She didn't say my name. She didn't say, "Excuse me, Mrs. Lin." She didn't say anything at all. She simply wrapped her fingers around my upper arm, firmly, the way you grip luggage you're about to redirect. And she steered me 2 steps to the left, away from James, away from the conversation, away from the space I had been standing in, as though I were a piece of furniture that had been placed incorrectly and needed to be corrected before the photographs were taken. Then she smiled at James, said something bright and social, and walked away. She didn't look back at me once. I stood exactly where she had put me. I did not follow her. I did not call after her. I smoothed the sleeve of my dress where her fingers had been, and I felt the particular clarity that arrives in certain moments. Not anger, not humiliation, though both of those were present, but something beneath them, something older and quieter. The kind of clarity that comes when a thing you have been watching slowly for a very long time finally reveals itself completely. I found my seat at table 11. I opened my evening bag. I sent one text. And then, I set my phone face down on the white linen tablecloth, folded my hands, and watched my son dance with his new wife in the center of the room they didn't know I owned. If this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Linda's Life Diaries, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true. The family's comfort. Let me tell you about Vivian Chen, née Ashworth. She was 29 years old when she married my son. Slim, well-dressed, possessed of the particular brand of confidence that comes from having grown up with money and never once having to question whether it would still be there in the morning. She had graduated from Emory with a business degree, worked 3 years at her father's commercial development firm, Ashworth Properties, which operates out of a sleek tower in Buckhead, and she had the air of someone who had been told, repeatedly and sincerely, that she was exceptional. I don't say any of this unkindly. Vivian was, by most measures, a capable young woman. She knew how to read a room. She knew how to be charming when charming was useful. She could orchestrate a dinner party with the precision of an air traffic controller, and she remembered the names of people she had met only once, which is a skill that requires either genuine warmth or genuine calculation, and I was still, after 2 years of watching her, unable to determine which it was in Vivian's case. What I know for certain is this. Vivian Ashworth had grown up believing that the world was organized according to a hierarchy that she understood perfectly, and that her position within that hierarchy was comfortably near the top. She was not cruel in the way that people who enjoy cruelty are cruel. She was cruel in the way that people who have never been corrected are cruel, thoughtlessly, efficiently, with the clean conscience of someone who genuinely cannot imagine that the people they dismiss might matter. She saw me as a variable to be managed, not a threat, not a person with a history and a career and a life that had shaped the landscape she was walking through. Just a variable, Daniel's mother, the quiet widow who needed to be kept pleasant and appropriately distant, like a piece of antique furniture that has sentimental value but doesn't quite fit the new decor. My son, Daniel, is 34 years old. He is bright and kind and genuinely funny in the way that people are funny when they've spent a lot of time thinking carefully about the world. He called me every Sunday until he met Vivian. Visits were regular. Holidays were assumed. There was a version of my relationship with Daniel that existed before Vivian entered it, and it was a good one, not perfect, because what relationship is, but real, rooted, the kind of thing you build over 34 years of showing up for someone. Then came the renovation. That's the only word for what Vivian did to my relationship with my son, and I say it without venom because I think she was largely unconscious of doing it. She didn't plot to separate Daniel from his mother. She simply had a very clear picture of what her life was supposed to look like. And in that picture, the mother-in-law was a figure in the background, present for appropriate occasions, warm enough not to cause discomfort, but not someone whose opinions shaped decisions or whose presence was expected without an invitation. The Sunday calls became monthly. The monthly calls became occasional. The visits acquired a scheduling formality that had never existed before. Text first, confirm the date, confirm it again, and sometimes, 3 hours before I was expected to arrive, receive a message from Daniel that said something careful and apologetic about Vivian's work schedule, her family coming into town, a thing that had come up. I never complained. I kept my voice pleasant. I said, "Of course, no problem. We'll reschedule." And I meant every word of it because I understood something that took me a long time to learn and that I will not unlearn. You cannot hold your children's love by demanding it. You can only make yourself the kind of person they choose to return to. I made my coffee. I tended my garden. I went to the office 3 days a week and managed the things I had spent 31 years quietly building. I waited. On the cruelty, specific, domestic, real. The first time I understood what I was dealing with, I had been married to Daniel's father, Robert, for 26 years. Robert died 4 years ago, the kind of death that happens without warning. A blood clot, a Tuesday afternoon, a paramedic in our kitchen, and then nothing. He was 64 years old, and he had been planning to retire the following spring. We had talked about Portugal. We had looked at photographs of small white houses near the water. 6 months after Robert's death, Daniel brought Vivian to Sunday dinner for the first time. I had cooked for 4 hours. I had set the table with the china that belonged to Robert's mother, the pieces I use only for occasions that matter. Vivian sat across from me and looked around the dining room with the polite interest of someone taking inventory, and she asked me, in a tone that was perfectly reasonable, how long I planned to stay in such a large house now that I was living alone. It wasn't the question itself. Questions are just questions. It was the word such, the faint surprise embedded in it, the implication that the house and I were somehow mismatched, now that Robert was gone. That what had once been a home was now simply an asset that hadn't yet been liquidated. I told her I planned to stay as long as I pleased. She smiled and changed the subject. That was in the spring. By the following Christmas, a pattern had established itself. I would be informed of holiday plans rather than consulted. My input on decisions that affected me, where we would gather, when, what I might contribute, arrived as courtesy updates rather than genuine invitations. At Daniel and Vivian's first Thanksgiving as a couple, hosted at their home in Brookhaven, I arrived to find that Vivian's parents, Tom and Carol Ashworth, had been given the seats at either end of the dining table. I sat in the middle, beside Vivian's younger sister, who was on her phone throughout the meal and apologized to me exactly once for it. It's not that the seat in the middle was worse than any other. It is that the arrangement communicated something. Clearly, deliberately, without a word being spoken about it. About whose family this table belonged to. I ate the turkey. I complimented the stuffing, which was from a box and slightly underseasoned. I helped clear the plates. At Easter the following year, Daniel mentioned offhandedly that Vivian thought it might be nice if I joined them for brunch rather than dinner. Less time, less cooking, easier for everyone. He said it the way people say things they have been coached to say, with a careful lightness that barely conceals the weight of the conversation that preceded it. I said brunch sounded lovely. I brought the lemon cake I had been making for Easter, since before Daniel was born. Vivian put it on the counter and served a bakery tart instead. The lemon cake made the ride home with me, untouched. There was the birthday, Daniel's 33rd, where the dinner reservation had been made for 4 people, and I was not among the 4. And when I mentioned it, gently, so the explanation was that it had been meant to be a small celebration with Vivian's family, her parents and sister, and somehow the communication to me had gotten confused. Daniel was apologetic. Genuinely apologetic, I think. But apologetic the way people are when they have allowed a thing to happen that they didn't stop. There was the evening I arrived for what I understood to be a family dinner, and found that Vivian's friends were also there. 8 people I had never met, filling the living room and the kitchen, and I understood immediately that my visit had been forgotten entirely. Vivian's expression when she opened the door told me everything. Not guilt. Inconvenience. "Oh, Margaret, yes, of course, come in." She used my first name. She had never used my first name before. She had called me Mrs. Lin or Daniel's mom. And both of those had the correct amount of distance in them. The appropriate acknowledgement that I was something specific to her. Not a friend, not an equal, but a category. The first name felt like a demotion. The removal of the category entirely, the flattening of me into a generic woman who had arrived at an inconvenient time. I stayed for 40 minutes. I found my coat on my own. I drove home on a highway I had driven for 31 years and thought about Robert, who had known people the way I could never quite learn to, generously, without keeping score. And I wondered what he would say about all of this. Knowing Robert, he would say something that made me laugh, and then he would make me tea, and then he would ask me what I wanted to do about it. What I wanted to do about it was what I had always done about difficult things. I wanted to wait. I wanted to watch. I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I decided what, if anything, needed to be done. I am by nature a patient person. 31 years of practicing commercial real estate law, and then another 12 of managing and expanding a portfolio of properties in this city, had made me more patient still. You learn in that work that the person who speaks first in a negotiation rarely wins it. You learn that most people will eventually show you exactly what they are, if you give them enough room and enough time. Vivian was showing me what the family does not know. Here is what Vivian Ashworth Chen, and her father, Tom Ashworth, and her mother, Carol, and her entire family, with their sleek Buckhead Tower, and their charitable giving, and their society column photographs, did not know about me. They knew I had been a lawyer. This they found mildly interesting for about 30 seconds before filing it away. Retired widow, lives alone in a house in Decatur that is too large for her. These were the coordinates they had given me. The full picture never occurred to them to seek. Robert and I had built our life carefully and without noise. Robert was a structural engineer, good at his work, modest about it, the kind of man who built things that lasted and then stepped back to let other people stand in front of them. In 1996, he and I purchased our first commercial property together, a small office building in Midtown that needed more work than we could afford, which we did the work on anyway, evenings and weekends, learning as we went. We sold it 4 years later for a number that made us both quiet for a few days afterward. Then we bought 2 more. Then 5. Then we reorganized everything into a holding structure, on the advice of the attorney I had hired, a young woman who handled things I was too close to handle myself, and we kept building, quietly, without making any of it anyone's business but our own. When Robert died, the portfolio was significant. Not Ashworth Properties significant, not a tower in Buckhead and a name on a hospital wing, but significant. 14 commercial properties in Atlanta, 3 in Charlotte, 2 in Birmingham, the kind of numbers that take your breath away when you say them out loud, which I very rarely do. Most people in my life knew me as a retired lawyer who gardened and managed some rental income. The word some was doing considerable work in that sentence, but I never corrected it. Daniel knew there was money. He knew his parents had been careful and that he would be comfortable when the time came. He did not know the specifics because the specifics were mine and Robert's, and then mine alone, and I saw no reason to share them with anyone who had not earned the full picture. Vivian's parents knew about commercial real estate the way musicians know about accounting. In theory, in outline, enough to recognize the category. They had never thought to look closely at who owned what in this city, because the world as they understood it was organized around names they recognized, and mine was not among them. This was not an accident. I had spent 31 years building something quiet and lasting, and entirely my own, and I had learned, through long experience, that the moment you announce what you have, the thing you have becomes the most important thing about you. People stop seeing you. They start seeing the numbers. I preferred to be seen. I preferred to be underestimated, actually. There is a particular freedom in being underestimated that I have come to value the way I value good light and strong coffee, as something that makes everything else easier to see clearly. Non the silence and the watch. In the 2 years between Daniel and Vivian's engagement and their wedding day, I paid attention. I watched the way Vivian spoke to Daniel when she thought I wasn't listening. The faint edge in her voice when he contradicted her. The particular way she paused before responding to something she didn't like, gathering herself before she spoke. I watched how Tom Ashworth moved through rooms, the way his eyes measured everything, calculating value and precedence with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for a long time. I watched Carol, who had the exhausted graciousness of someone who has spent 20 years being pleasant in service of her husband's social ambitions. I watched Daniel. This was the watching that cost me something. My son is not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that. But there is a version of not cruelty that is also not courage. And Daniel occupied that territory during the 2 years of his engagement with a consistency that I found both painful and informative. He saw what Vivian did, the small exclusions, the managed distances, the way I was positioned in his life, the way you position a piece of background scenery, and he did not address it. He apologized privately. He called when he thought I might need calling. He sent flowers on my birthday with a card that was generous and specific, the way his notes have always been. But he did not say to Vivian, "This is not how we treat my mother." He did not hold that line. I understood why. I did not excuse it, but I understood it. Vivian was his life now, the life he had chosen. And there is a mathematics to marriage that most people learn the hard way, the calculation of which hills are worth dying on, and which ones you let go in order to keep the peace of your house and the warmth of your bed. I had been married for 26 years. I knew the mathematics. I simply wished the calculation had come out differently. In the meantime, I watched. I attended things I was invited to and did not complain about the things I wasn't. I brought appropriate gifts and said appropriate things and left at appropriate times. When Vivian made the plans for the wedding and I was not consulted about the guest list or the venue or the flowers or anything at all until Daniel called me, somewhat apologetically, to share the decisions that had already been made. I listened carefully and said the things a mother says when she is choosing her battles, and I let none of what I felt show in my voice. I had noticed the venue when Daniel told me its name, the Hargrove Estate, a beautiful property in Buckhead, a restored plantation house with formal gardens, and a carriage house that had been renovated into an event space. I had been to one event there before, a charity gala 3 years earlier, and I had admired the bones of the place, the high ceilings, the original heart pine floors, the way the evening light came through the garden windows and made everything golden. I had not mentioned, at the time, that the company managing the estate's operations held a master lease on the property from a commercial real estate holding company whose primary investor was me. I also had not mentioned it when Daniel told me the wedding would be held there. I let that information sit quietly in the back of my mind, the way you let a card sit in your hand when you are not yet sure whether the time to play it has arrived. I watched Tom Ashworth talk about the venue at the engagement dinner, the pride in his voice, the implication that this was their kind of place, their world, arranged by people like them for people like them. I watched Vivian oversee every detail of the wedding as though it were a corporate acquisition. She was efficient and exacting, and she produced something genuinely beautiful, and I gave her full credit for that, internally, while noting that at no point in 8 months of planning had she asked me a single question about what I might like. I watched all of it. I kept notes, not in a notebook, but in the careful architecture of my memory, the way I have always kept the important things. I filed it. I waited. Then came the morning of the wedding. The trigger, the morning of Daniel and Vivian's wedding, was a Saturday in April, the kind of Atlanta spring day that makes you forget winter existed. Clear sky, cool air, the dogwoods still holding on. I dressed carefully. Navy blue silk, the good pearls that had been Robert's mother's, low heels because I was 67 years old, and I was not going to suffer for aesthetics, not even on my son's wedding day. I arrived at the Hargrove estate at 2 o'clock, an hour before the ceremony. I had been told, not asked, that family photographs would begin at 2:30. I came early because that is what I do. I had been early to everything for 67 years, and I was not going to stop now. The estate was beautiful in the afternoon light. The gardens had been dressed with white flowers that moved gently in the breeze, and the staff moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing. I recognized the events coordinator, a woman named Patricia, who had been managing the estate for 6 years, and we exchanged a warm greeting that surprised Vivian's mother, who was standing nearby, and who had not previously been given reason to think of me as someone Patricia would know by name. I found Daniel before the ceremony, in the carriage house where the men were gathered, and I held his face in my hands the way I had when he was small, and I said what I needed to say. He had tears in his eyes. He has always been like that, emotional under pressure, moved by the weight of things, which is something I love about him even when it is inconvenient. I told him I loved him and that his father would have been so proud and that everything was going to be wonderful. I meant all of it. Then I went to find my seat. Or rather, I went to where I thought my seat was, which is when I encountered the first problem. I had been told, again, told, that family would be seated in the first 3 rows. I had assumed that as the groom's mother, I would be in the first row, which is the traditional arrangement, the thing that is done at every wedding in every culture I am aware of. I found instead that the first row was occupied entirely by the Ashworth family, Tom and Carol in the center, Vivian's sister and her husband on one side, Vivian's grandparents on the other. The second row held Daniel's college friends, the people Vivian had decided represented the groom's contingent. I found my name on a small card at the aisle seat of the third row. I stood there for a moment, looking at the card. Then I took my seat without saying anything, because I have learned that the most important battles are rarely fought in the moments when you most want to fight them, and because I could see across the garden that Daniel was still in the carriage house and would not know what had been done, and I chose, in that moment, to protect him from knowing. The ceremony was beautiful. Vivian was genuinely radiant. Daniel cried at the altar, and Vivian touched his face and smiled, and for a moment all of it fell away. The seat assignments, the years of small exclusions, cue the 8 months of planning that had proceeded entirely without me, and I felt only what I always feel when I watch my child reach something important. Love, simple and complete, the kind that doesn't depend on being treated well. Then the ceremony ended. The guests moved to the reception hall, and that is when Vivian grabbed my arm. I was near the head table. James, Daniel's roommate, whom I've known for 12 years, had found me in the crowd and pulled me into a conversation about a story Daniel had told him once, a story I remembered differently, and we were laughing about the discrepancy when Vivian's hand closed around my upper arm. No words, no apology, just the firm, redirecting grip. 2 steps to the left, released. And then she turned her back to me and gave James her most luminous smile and said something that made him laugh. And she moved away, and I was standing exactly where she had placed me, like something she had straightened. The room went very quiet around me, in the way rooms do when 40 people have just witnessed something they don't know how to address. I smoothed my sleeve. I found table 11. I opened my evening bag and took out my phone. And I typed 6 words to my attorney, Eleanor Park, who has handled every significant transaction of my professional life for the past 19 years, and who keeps her phone on even on Saturday evenings, and who knew, when she saw those 6 words, exactly what they meant. I set the phone face down on the white linen tablecloth. I folded my hands. When I watched my son dance with his wife in the center of the room, he was happy. He was genuinely, completely happy, the way people are happy when they don't yet know what's coming. And I sat with that, with his happiness, with the music, with the dogwood visible through the tall garden windows, still holding on. And I made the decision I had been moving toward for 2 years, slowly, in the way that slow things accumulate into something final and irreversible. I had been patient long enough. The text had been sent. The rest was already in motion. Rising tension. Eleanor Park called me Sunday morning at 8:15. I was in my garden, which is where I go when I need to think without the walls of the house pressing in around me. Robert planted most of it. The camellias along the back fence. Now the old climbing rose that has taken over the trellis by the gate. The fig tree that drops fruit every August with an enthusiasm that borders on aggressive. I maintain it the way I maintain most things, carefully, consistently, without making a production of it. I got your text, Eleanor said. I know you did. 6 words, Margaret. They were sufficient. She laughed, a short, dry sound that I have come to associate with her versions of affection. Eleanor is 52 years old and has the particular economy of someone who has spent 3 decades in rooms where words cost money. She does not waste them. The Hargrove estate, she said, the master lease. Yes. And the Ashworth development on Peachtree Industrial. I hadn't mentioned that yet. You've been paying attention. You pay me to pay attention. A pause. How bad was it? I told her about the arm. I told her about the seat assignment. I told her about the lemon cake from 2 years ago, not because it was legally relevant, but because Eleanor has always understood that the full picture matters, that you cannot understand a situation from its final moment alone, that what looks like a single incident is usually the visible portion of something much larger and much older. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I value most about her. When I finished, she said, "What do you want to happen?" "I want things to be corrected," I said. "In what order?" "In the order that makes the most sense." Another pause. I could hear her writing. Eleanor always writes by hand during important calls. She says it slows her down enough to think. "The Hargrove lease renewal comes up in 60 days, she said. "I'm aware." "And the Ashworth development on Peachtree, they're applying for a variance on the residential component. The zoning board meets next month. They need clean title on the adjacent parcel to support the application." Another pause. The adjacent parcel. "Yes," I said, "which is held by a subsidiary of the Lin Family Trust," I said, "which Eleanor Park manages." The silence that followed was almost warm. "Margaret," she said finally. "I'm not doing anything precipitous," I said. "I'm not doing anything unkind. I'm simply going to stop being invisible. I am going to allow certain things to become visible that have always been there, but that no one has ever troubled themselves to look at." And Daniel? That was the question I had been sitting with all morning. The fig tree was dropping a fruit onto the path below, unhurried, and I watched it land and thought about my son. The way he had looked at the altar, the tears on his face, the genuine happiness. I loved Daniel completely. I would always love Daniel completely. But love is not the same as silence, and I had been silent for long enough that the silence itself had become a kind of complicity. Daniel will be fine, I said. Daniel is a good man who has been making some poor choices. Those are correctable. And Vivian? Vivian will learn something useful, I said, about the people she touches without asking. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll have the documentation ready by Thursday. The week after a wedding has a particular texture, the deflation of something long anticipated, the return of ordinary life after all that extraordinary effort. Daniel and Vivian had gone to the Maldives for their honeymoon. 10 days. I knew this because Daniel had told me, and because Vivian's Instagram had documented the journey with the thoroughness of a field report, every meal and sunset cataloged and filtered and presented to the world as evidence of a life being lived at the correct pitch. I do not follow Vivian on Instagram. Her sister follows me, for reasons I have never investigated, and occasionally shows me things. I went to the office on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I had 3 meetings that week, all routine, all unremarkable to anyone who did not know what was beginning to move beneath the surface of them. On Tuesday afternoon, I had coffee with a woman named Grace Cho, who sits on the Fulton County Zoning Board and whose nonprofit serves a neighborhood that one of my properties anchors. We talked about the nonprofit, about a funding gap she was navigating, about a grant I had mentioned the previous year that might be worth revisiting. We did not talk about the Ashworth development. We did not talk about the variance application. We talked about Grace's work, and we talked about Robert, whom Grace had known slightly, and we talked about the city, which we both love, in the particular way that people love a place they have built something in. On Wednesday, I had lunch with a man named Howard Tillman, who is a senior partner at the commercial real estate firm that manages 3 of Ashworth Properties' flagship developments. Howard and I have known each other for 20 years. We have served on 2 boards together, and we have disagreed about several things and agreed about more. He is, in the vocabulary of my professional life, someone who respects me. He told me, over salad, that Tom Ashworth had been in an expansive mood lately, that the Peachtree development was the biggest project Ashworth Properties had undertaken in a decade, that the residential variance was the linchpin. Without it, the financial projections didn't hold, the bank's terms would change, and the whole thing became a different kind of problem. I listened. I ate my salad. I asked a few questions about the timeline. Tom's confident, Howard said. Very confident. You know how he is. I do, I said. On Thursday, Eleanor sent me the documentation. I read it carefully, the way I read everything, not for what it said, but for what it meant, for the shape of the thing beneath the words. Everything was in order. Everything had always been in order. I had simply never had occasion to make it legible to the people it most concerned. I made 2 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to the management company that administered the Hargrove estate. The second was to my attorney for the Lin family trust holdings, a different person from Eleanor, a quiet man named Stephen Yee, who had been handling that side of my affairs for 14 years, and who understood, when I explained what I needed, exactly why I needed it without requiring further explanation. By Thursday evening, the relevant letters had been drafted. I did not send them yet. I set them aside and I went to my garden, and I tended the rose along the trellis, which had produced 3 new blooms that week and was beginning to sprawl in a direction that would eventually become a problem. I deadheaded the spent flowers. I worked for an hour in the late afternoon light, and I thought about nothing in particular, and I felt, for the first time since the wedding, something close to calm. Daniel and Vivian came home from the Maldives on a Friday. Daniel called me Saturday morning. Mom! His voice was warm. The honeymoon had done something good for him. I could hear it, the looseness of it, the absence of the particular tension he had been carrying for the past 8 months of wedding planning. How are you? I've been thinking about you. I'm well, I said. The garden is beautiful. Tell me about the Maldives. He told me about the Maldives. He is a good storyteller. He has always been a good storyteller, even as a child. The way he could hold the thread of something and know exactly when to pull it. He told me about the water, the impossibility of the water, and about a boat they took to an island that had no electricity, and about a meal they ate on a beach at sunset, and about how, at one point, Vivian had laughed so hard she had fallen off her chair. He told me this last detail with genuine delight, the way people speak about the private moments of love that they still can't quite believe they're allowed to have. I listened. I loved him while I listened. Both of those things were true at once. He didn't mention the arm. He didn't mention the seat. Whether Vivian had told him about either one, or whether he had noticed the seat and not addressed it, or whether both things had simply been absorbed into the general noise of a wedding day, I didn't know. I didn't ask. There is a time for asking. That time had not arrived. We should have dinner, he said. The four of us. You and me and Viv and… Actually, Mom, are you seeing anyone? You can bring someone. I'm not seeing anyone, I said. And dinner would be lovely. Next weekend? We're in Atlanta the whole week. Next weekend is fine. He said he loved me. He said it easily, naturally, the way he had always said it, without the careful orchestration of someone performing the role of good son. I believed him. I have always believed him. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, with my coffee and the morning coming through the east window the way it always does, turning everything a particular shade of gold that I have never quite been able to name. I thought about what I was doing and why I was doing it, the way I always examine the reasons for things before I proceed with them. I was not doing this out of spite. I want to be absolutely clear about that, even here, even in the privacy of my own accounting of events. Spite would have been faster and louder and far less useful. I was doing this because a line had been crossed, not the line of the arm at the wedding, which was merely the most visible instance of a much longer pattern, but a deeper line, the one that separates behavior that can be tolerated from behavior that, if tolerated, teaches the wrong lesson permanently. Vivian needed to learn something. Tom Ashworth needed to learn something. And Daniel, my gentle, conflict-avoidant, genuinely good son, needed to learn something too, though his lesson was different from theirs. The lesson would arrive in its own time. I was patient. I had been patient for 2 years, and I could be patient for a few more weeks. I went to the office. I did not send the letters. Not yet. The dinner was on a Saturday, held at Daniel and Vivian's house in Brookhaven. A beautiful house, by any measure, yet one that Vivian had spent 18 months renovating with the focused intensity of someone who understood that a home is a statement and was determined that hers say the right things. It said them clearly. Everything was curated and considered and impeccably lit. There were flowers from what looked like a very good florist, and wine from what was definitely a very good shop, and the kitchen smelled like something that had been cooking slowly for several hours. Vivian greeted me at the door with a hug that was warmer than usual. She was, in the weeks after her wedding, softer, the particular softening of someone who has completed a long effort and can now breathe. She took my coat and asked about my drive and poured me a glass of white wine before I could ask for one. I accepted the wine. I said the house looked beautiful, which it did. I meant it, which I also did. Tom and Carol Ashworth were there, which I had not been told to expect. They arrived 20 minutes after I did. Tom in the particular way he enters rooms. Loudly, generously, filling the space with bonhomie that has the consistency and the approximate sincerity of a campaign promise. Carol followed, wearing the expression she always wears, the one that says she has been married to this man for 35 years and has made her peace with everything that entails. Tom shook my hand with the energy of someone who has decided to be very pleasant to you. Margaret, he said, you look wonderful. That was a beautiful wedding, wasn't it? Our Vivian did something extraordinary. She did, I said. I meant this too. Whatever else Vivian was, she had produced a beautiful wedding. And you enjoyed it? Everything to your satisfaction? I looked at him. He had the steady, confident gaze of a man who has never doubted his own read of a room. It was a memorable day, I said. He nodded, satisfied, and moved past me toward the kitchen, where Daniel was opening wine and where Tom had decided his attention was more usefully deployed. Carol touched my arm, gently, briefly, the way polite women touch each other. Vivian showed me photographs, she said. Your dress was beautiful. Thank you, I said. The navy was perfect. I looked at Carol Ashworth, and I saw something I don't think I had properly seen before. The particular tiredness of someone who has spent a long time making herself smaller in service of someone else's largeness, who has developed, through long practice, a genuine kindness that exists in the spaces her husband doesn't fill. I felt something toward her that I had not expected to feel. Sympathy. I said, your family looked beautiful too. She smiled, and it was real, and I held it for a moment before we were both gathered into the general motion of the dinner. The conversation over dinner was the kind that happens between families who are still in the early negotiations of becoming a family. Careful, exploratory, occasionally warm, occasionally careful again. Tom talked about the Peachtree development with the enthusiasm of a man describing his finest work to date. He talked about the residential component, the projected returns, the anchor tenants already committed. He talked about the architectural vision with borrowed expertise, the words of the architects and developers he worked with, assembled into sentences that sounded authoritative unless you listened closely to the seams. I listened closely. Daniel asked questions. He is genuinely interested in business, less in its financial dimensions than in its human ones, in the stories of how things get built and why, in the decisions people make when they have limited information and imperfect options. He asked Tom about the design choices, and Tom answered with the practiced confidence of someone who has been asked these questions before and knows exactly which answers land well. At one point, Tom said, the variance application is the key piece. Once that's through, the whole thing unlocks. It's a formality, really. She's at this stage. I was eating a piece of salmon, which was very good, and I did not look up. Zoning can be unpredictable, I said. Tom smiled. We've got good relationships on the board. Relationships help, I said agreeably. Vivian glanced at me, briefly. She had an instinct for subtext. It was one of the things I had noticed about her from the beginning. She couldn't quite read what she was picking up in that moment, but she registered that something was there. I smiled at her and reached for my wine. After dinner, while Daniel and Tom were washing dishes, Daniel had recruited Tom with the particular determined cheerfulness he uses to make men do things they don't realize they've agreed to. Vivian and Carol and I sat in the living room, and Vivian showed us photographs from the honeymoon on her phone. Mom, so look at this, she said, holding the phone toward Carol. This is the beach where we had the sunset dinner. Carol made appropriate sounds of delight. Then Vivian turned the phone toward me, and for a moment, genuinely, without performance, she looked like the young woman she was, slightly undone by her own happiness, wanting to share it. I took the phone. I looked at the photograph. Daniel and Vivian on a beach at sunset, the water behind them an impossible shade of blue, both of them laughing, her head tipping back and his arm around her. You look very happy, I said. We were, she said. We are. I handed the phone back. I looked at her, at the softness that marriage had produced in her, or the honeymoon, or simply the relief of a long effort completed, and I thought, this is what I'm protecting too. This version of her. This capacity for happiness. Because what she had done, the pattern she had established, the behavior she had allowed herself, the hand on my arm. Those things, if uncorrected, would calcify, would become permanent, would eventually cost her more than she could afford to pay. I have lived long enough to know this. You cannot teach it to someone directly. You can only arrange the conditions under which they learn it themselves. The letters were drafted. The documentation was ready. The timing was a matter of judgment. I said goodnight. I thanked Vivian for dinner, sincerely. I hugged my son in the doorway and felt the familiar architecture of him. Still my child, always my child. And I drove home through the Atlanta night, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about the next step. It was Eleanor who called me first, on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after the dinner, with a particular note in her voice that meant something had happened on its own before I had needed to make it happen. The Hargrove Estate Management Company, she said, has received notice that their management contract is under review. I set down my coffee. I haven't sent anything yet. No, I know. This came from the estate's ownership side. The entity that controls the master lease has apparently been doing a general portfolio audit, reviewing all the management arrangements. Standard practice. A pause. It's not standard, of course. No, I agreed, but it's entirely within the rights of the leasing entity to request a comprehensive operations review. The management company has 30 days to respond with documentation. And the estate's event bookings? On hold pending the review, Eleanor said, per the terms of the lease. I was quiet for a moment. I had not anticipated this particular sequence. Stephen Yee, my trust attorney, had apparently been more proactive than I had instructed. I would have to speak with him about the pace, but the effect was not wrong. Who will the management company contact? I asked. They'll try to reach the ownership entity directly, Eleanor said, which will route them to Stephen's office, which will route them to whoever Stephen decides to route them to. Which is you, she said simply. I learned about the phone call from Tom Ashworth through Daniel, which is how I had expected to learn about it. Tom had called Daniel on a Wednesday evening, his voice carrying the particular register of a man who is concerned, but managing that concern carefully so as not to alarm anyone unnecessarily. He had mentioned, in passing, as a matter of general curiosity, whether Daniel's mother had any involvement in commercial properties in Atlanta. Daniel had said yes, she does. She has some rental holdings. Tom had said, interesting, and had changed the subject. Daniel told me about it the following Sunday when he called. He told it as a small thing, curious, somewhat amusing. Dad's apparently been doing some research, he said, using his default childhood term for Tom, which had always struck me as poignant. He asked about you. What did you tell him? That you have some properties. I don't actually know the details, Mom. You've never really told me. No, I agreed. I haven't. A pause. Should I know the details? This was the question I had been waiting for. Not the crisis, not the revelation, not the moment of maximum visibility, but this one, quiet and specific, my son asking me directly whether there was something he should understand about his own mother that he had been allowed to not understand until now. Yes, I said. I think you probably should. We met at my house on a Tuesday afternoon. Just Daniel, not Vivian. I had not specified this, but he had understood it, which told me something about what he had been putting together in the days since Tom's call. He arrived at 2:00. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had written checks and made plans and eaten alone on 100 evenings since Robert died, and I told him the shape of things. Not everything, not the numbers, not the full architecture of the Lin family trust, not the specific instruments that Eleanor and Stephen had been managing for years. I told him enough. I told him about the Hargrove estate and the master lease. I told him about the subsidiary that held the parcel adjacent to the Peachtree development. I told him about the 15 properties in 3 states. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Outside, the fig tree was throwing shadows across the garden in the afternoon light. A bird, I think it was a mockingbird, we have several, was doing its complicated borrowed song from somewhere in the camellias. Mom, Daniel said finally. Yes. Why didn't you ever tell me? I thought about how to answer this. I had thought about it, in various forms, for many years. Because it wasn't the most important thing about me, I said, and I didn't want it to become the most important thing. He looked at me. He has Robert's eyes, that particular shade of brown that is almost amber in certain light, and he was looking at me with something I recognized from his childhood. The expression of someone revising a picture they thought they understood. Does Vivian know? No. Does her father? He's beginning to understand that there are things he doesn't know, I said, which is a different thing. Daniel was quiet again. Then, the Hargrove estate. That's where we got married. Yes. He absorbed this. I watched him absorb it. And the Peachtree development. The adjacent parcel, yes. Tom's variance application depends on that parcel. The clean title on that parcel is a significant factor in the application, yes. Daniel looked at his coffee. Then he looked at me. Mom, what are you doing? And this. This was the moment I had been moving toward. Not the documentation, not the letters, not the management review. This conversation at this table, with my son asking me directly what I was doing and why. I'm becoming visible, I said. I have been invisible for long enough. He was very still. I am not going to harm your marriage, I said. I am not going to harm Tom's development, not permanently. I am not interested in causing damage for the sake of damage. You know me well enough to know that. I know, he said quietly. But something happened at your wedding, I said. And it was not the first thing. And if nothing changes, it will not be the last thing. And I have decided that I will not allow that. Silence. She grabbed your arm, he said. So he had known. Yes, I said. He put his hands over his face. Not dramatic. Daniel is never dramatic. Just the gesture of a man who needs a moment. Then he lowered them. I saw it, he said. I was across the room, and I saw it. And I didn't say anything. And I should have said something, and I didn't. No, I said. You didn't. I'm sorry, Mom. I know you are. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. You are a good man, Daniel. You have always been a good man. But you have been making a particular mistake. And the mistake is this. You have been treating my comfort as optional in order to protect someone else's convenience, and that has to stop. He didn't argue. He looked at our hands on the table. His father's hands, broad across the knuckles, the same shape exactly. What do you need from me? He asked. I need you to have a conversation with your wife, I said. I need you to have it before anything else happens. I need her to understand, from you, not from circumstances, that I am a person in your life, not a variable to be managed, and that the way I am treated matters to you. And if I do that? Then we move forward, I said. Together. All of us. He nodded slowly. And if I don't? I squeezed his hand once. Then I let go. Then the circumstances will do the teaching instead, I said. And that is a harder lesson for everyone. So yes, if this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Linda's Life Diaries. The best ones are still coming, and the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. He left at 4 o'clock. I stood in the doorway and watched his car back out of the driveway, and I felt something that I can only describe as a kind of grief. Not for what had been lost, but for what had been necessary, for the distance that love sometimes has to travel before it can be honest. Then I went inside. I called Eleanor. Hold everything for 2 weeks, I said. How long? 2 weeks. Then we'll see. She understood without asking further. So this is one of the reasons I have worked with Eleanor Park for 19 years. He must have talked to Vivian that evening, or the next morning. I don't know exactly what he said, because he has never told me, and I have never asked. I know only that 4 days after Daniel came to my house, Vivian called me. She called on a Saturday morning. I was in the garden. "Mrs. Lin," she said. "Vivienne." A pause. I could hear the effort in the silence. The particular effort of someone who is accustomed to control finding themselves in a situation where control is not the available strategy. "I'd like to come see you," she said, "if that's all right." "Of course," I said. "Come for tea." She arrived at 11. She was, as she always is, impeccably dressed. But there was something underneath the presentation that was different, something stripped of the usual armor. She sat at my kitchen table, in the chair where Daniel had sat 4 days earlier, and I put tea in front of her, and I sat across from her, and I waited. "Daniel told me about the properties," she said. "I expected he would." She looked at her tea. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." "Mrs. Lin." She looked up. Her eyes were very direct. I had always noticed that about her, that she looked straight at things, even when the looking was uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology." I said nothing. "At the wedding," she said. "The way what I did. With your arm." She stopped. "It was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, and I did it anyway, and I have been thinking about it every day since, and I don't have an explanation that makes it acceptable." I looked at her, at the effort this was costing her, at the genuine discomfort of a woman who has rarely been in the position of having been wrong about something and being unable to manage that wrongness into a more comfortable shape. "That is a good apology," I said. She exhaled. "I have also. I know that the seat arrangement at the wedding was not what it should have been. And the planning. The way you were kept outside the planning." She looked at her hands. "I told myself I was being efficient. I told myself I was just managing a complicated process. But that's not what it was." "What was it?" A long pause. "I think I was afraid of you," she said finally. "Not of you specifically, but of what you represented. Of Daniel having a strong relationship with you. Of feeling like I was competing with something I couldn't win against." She looked up. "That's not a justification. It's an explanation." I held the explanation for a moment, the way you hold something heavy to understand its actual weight. Vivian Ashworth Chen, who moved through rooms like she owned them, had been afraid of me, of a 67-year-old widow with a garden and a quiet office, and a life she had kept carefully private. The fear, I thought, was not entirely without basis. She had simply chosen the wrong response to it. "Fear is understandable," I said. "Acting from fear without examining it is where the trouble begins." She nodded. "I am not your competition, Vivian," I said. "I am Daniel's mother. That is a category that requires nothing from you except basic respect. I don't need a seat at the head table. I don't need to be consulted on flower arrangements. I need to be treated like a person who matters." "You do matter," she said. And then, quietly, "I didn't see you. I think that's the truest way I can say it. I didn't see you." I considered that for a long time. Outside, the mockingbird was at it again, its repertoire apparently inexhaustible. "Then let's begin," I said, "with you seeing me." The reveal. The management review of the Hargrove estate concluded on a Thursday morning in early June. I know the exact date because Eleanor called me while I was having breakfast. Oatmeal with sliced peaches from the farmer's market, which is what I eat in June when the peaches are correct. And she told me that the review was complete and that the documentation had been delivered to all relevant parties. Clean, thorough, entirely within the procedural rights of the leasing entity. Nothing dramatic, nothing punitive. Simply the full picture, made legible to the people who needed to see it. The management company had been cooperative. They were professionals, and professionals understand that ownership structures change, and that clarity, even inconvenient clarity, is preferable to confusion. The new terms of the management arrangement would take effect in 90 days. The terms were fair. I had been careful about that. The estate would continue operating. Events would be rescheduled. Nothing would be lost that didn't need to be lost. So what would be different was this. The name on the master lease, the entity that controlled the foundational agreement beneath everything the Hargrove Estates Management Company did, would no longer be obscured behind 3 layers of corporate structure. The Lin Family Trust. Clearly, cleanly, exactly where it had always been. I did not tell Daniel this was happening. He had asked me, 2 weeks earlier, to let him handle Vivian. He had done that. What happened in the subsequent business proceedings was a separate matter, one that had been in motion long before anyone was married, and that proceeded on its own logical timeline. I owed him honesty. I did not owe him advance warning of every document that bore my signature. I would tell him everything. I always tell Daniel everything, eventually, but the order of events matters. The order was, Vivian learns first. Tom learns second. Daniel learns last, with the fullest picture, in the right moment, at the right table. Tom Ashworth learned on a Friday. I know this because Howard Tillman called me that afternoon, not to report on Tom, exactly, but in the way that long colleagues call each other when something interesting has happened and they need someone who will understand why it's interesting without requiring extensive explanation. Tom called me, Howard said. Did he? He wanted to know if I knew anything about the Lin Family Trust. What did you tell him? I told him I knew you socially and that I had tremendous respect for your professional judgment. A pause, and I could hear Howard's particular enjoyment of the situation. Restrained, but real. He was quiet for a very long time after that. I imagine he was. He asked if you were active in the market. What did you say? I said you had always been active in the market, that you preferred to work quietly. Another pause. He asked how quietly. And? I said that, in my experience, Margaret Lin had never needed anyone to know what she was doing in order to do it. I smiled at this. Howard is, among his other qualities, occasionally perfect. Thank you, Howard. Tom also asked about the adjacent parcel on Peachtree Industrial. He would. He seemed to be recalibrating several things at once. That's a reasonable response to new information. Margaret. Howard's voice shifted slightly, warmer, more direct. He's going to call you. I know. What will you tell him? I looked out my office window at the Atlanta skyline, which I have looked at from this building for 11 years, and which I still find beautiful in the particular late afternoon light of June. I'll tell him the truth, I said. I always tell people the truth. I simply don't always tell it to them before they're ready to hear it. Tom called on Monday morning. He called my cell phone, which meant he had obtained the number from someone, Daniel, probably, or Vivienne, or possibly Howard, though Howard would have asked me first. I answered on the third ring. Margaret, he said. Tom. The pause that followed was the pause of a man who has spent a weekend revising an understanding of the world that he had considered settled, and it had the particular quality of effortful composure, the sound of someone choosing each word carefully after several days of discovering that the words he had been using were wrong. I wonder if we might meet, he said. Of course, I said. My office, Wednesday at 10. He agreed immediately, which told me something. Tom Ashworth, in my previous experience of him, was a man who proposed meetings rather than accepting them. That he took mine without negotiating the terms was a form of information. I told Eleanor, she told Stephen. Between the two of them, they assembled the relevant materials for Wednesday morning with the efficiency that 19 years of working together produces. As he arrived at 9:55, I have a good office. I say this not as a boast, but as a relevant fact. The space communicates something that I have found useful over the years, which is that the person who occupies it has been occupying it for a long time and intends to continue doing so. It is not a showy space. It is not designed to impress. It is a room full of books and files and the particular ordered density of a working life. And it says, quietly but clearly, that the woman who sits behind the desk in it has been building something here for a long time. Tom looked at it. He looked at it the way people look at things that require them to update a picture they had already considered finished. Not badly. Tom Ashworth is too practiced a businessman to let revision show plainly on his face. But I noticed the small recalibrations, the glance at the framed property maps on the wall, so the attention, brief but real, to the view of the city from the window, the particular pause before he sat down that told me he was deciding, in real time, what posture to adopt in this room. He chose gracious. I had expected he might. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "Of course." He placed his hands on the table between us, a deliberate gesture, open, the businessman's version of showing no weapons. "I'll be direct," he said. "I've spent the last week learning things about your professional history that I should have known considerably earlier." "Yes," I agreed. "I find myself in the position of having made some assumptions that were incomplete." "That's a diplomatic way to put it." He smiled briefly. "I've been told diplomacy is one of my better qualities." "I've been told the same about myself," I said. "We have perhaps both been diplomatic in directions that weren't useful." He acknowledged this with a slight nod. "The Hargrove estate," he said. "Yes." "The master lease." "Yes." "The parcel on Peachtree Industrial." "Yes." He looked at me. "I'd like to understand what you intend." This was the question I had been waiting for. Not an apology. Tom Ashworth was too proud and too practical for a direct apology in an opening position. But this question, which was in its own way more honest than an apology, "What do you intend?" The question of a man who has recognized that the terrain has changed and needs to understand the new geography before he can navigate it. "I intend to continue managing my assets responsibly," I said. "And the variance application?" "Has nothing to do with me unless it does." He studied me. "That's not entirely clarifying." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." A pause. Tom looked at the city through the window. Then he looked back at me. "My daughter married your son," he said. "She did." "We are family now, in the way that the parents of married children are family." "In that way, yes." "I would like—" He stopped, started again. "I have behaved, I think, in a way that did not fully account for who you are." "You treated me like the mother of the groom," I said, "which is a category with very specific dimensions in your mind, and those dimensions did not include any of the things that are currently relevant to you." He had the grace to hold this without deflecting. "Yes," he said, "that's accurate." "Your daughter did the same," I said, with more personal specificity. He looked at me steadily. "I know what happened at the wedding." "Do you?" "Vivian told me, after Daniel spoke to her." A pause. "After she spoke to you?" Another pause. It was not her best moment." "No," I said. "It was not." "She is not a cruel person, Margaret." "I know she isn't," I said, and I meant it. "She is a young woman who grew up in a world organized around a particular set of assumptions, and she imported those assumptions into her marriage without examining them. That is correctable. I am interested in correction." Tom was quiet for a moment. "And in the meantime—" "In the meantime," I said, "we proceed as neighbors proceed. Carefully, respectfully, with accurate information about who we are dealing with." He looked at the window again. The city lay below us in the June morning, the way it always does. Patient, enormous, indifferent to the particular negotiations of particular people, but shaped in small ways by all of them. "The parcel," he said, "will not be an obstacle," I said, "to a development managed by people who understand what they're building and who they're building beside." He held this, weighed it. Then, And the Hargrove management arrangement? Is being handled appropriately, I said, as are all my arrangements. He nodded slowly. We sat for a moment in the kind of silence that exists between two people who have recognized each other, not as friends, not yet, but as people of equivalent substance, which is a different thing and sometimes more durable. I should have asked about you, he said. When Daniel and Vivian became serious, I should have taken the time to understand who you were. Yes, I said. You should have. That was an oversight. It was a choice, I said, made quickly and without sufficient information. The consequence of making quick choices without sufficient information is that the information arrives later, in circumstances you didn't select. He smiled slowly, with something approaching respect. You are considerably more formidable than I realized, Margaret. Most people are, I said, when you trouble yourself to look. The response. I sent 2 things that week. The first was a letter, through Stephen's office, to the Hargrove Estate Management Company, confirming the new terms of the master lease arrangement and expressing my continued confidence in the estate's operations. The terms were fair. The letter was warm. It cost me nothing, and it cost the management company nothing, and it ensured that the estate continued to function as it always had, beautifully, efficiently, as a place where people held the events of their lives. Vivian and Daniel had their wedding there. That mattered. I was not going to unmake the place where my son was married. The point was not unmake anything. The point was to ensure that the people involved understood the geography they were standing on. The second thing I sent was a letter to the Fulton County Zoning Board. Not an objection to the Ashworth variance application. I had no objection to the development itself, which was, by most measures, a sound project in a part of the city that needed investment. The letter was instead a clarification regarding the clean title on the adjacent parcel, confirming that the Lin Family Trust held the parcel in question and that the trust had no objection to the variance application proceeding, subject to standard review. I copied Tom's attorney. Tom's attorney called Eleanor within the hour. Eleanor called me. Tom's attorney says Tom would like to express his personal gratitude, Eleanor said. He can express it directly, I said. He has my number. Tom called that afternoon. He was brief and genuine, which I appreciated. He said, I understand what you've done, and I understand what you chose not to do, and I want you to know that I don't take either of those things lightly. Good, I said. I'd like to have dinner, he said. The 6 of us, when Vivian and Daniel are available. That would be fine, I said. Let's find a date. There was one more thing. This one had nothing to do with business. It was smaller than everything else, and larger than everything else, in the way that the smallest true things often are. It was a Saturday, 3 weeks after my conversation with Tom. Daniel and Vivian came for dinner at my house. Just the 3 of us, no Tom and Carol, no occasion. Vivian had asked if she could bring something, and I had said yes, she could bring dessert, and she had arrived with a lemon cake. Not a bakery lemon cake. A homemade lemon cake, made from scratch, the kind that requires time and attention, and is slightly imperfect in the way that homemade things are slightly imperfect. She set it on the counter. She didn't say anything about it, but she looked at me when she set it down. And I looked at the cake, and neither of us needed to say anything because the cake said everything that needed to be said. I see you now. I'm trying. I'm showing you that I am trying in the specific language that you will understand. I understood. I said, that looks beautiful. My grandmother's recipe, Vivian said. She's been trying to teach me for 3 years. I think I finally have it. We'll find out, I said. She smiled. And I smiled. And that was the beginning of something different. Emotional resolution. That was 14 months ago. I am sitting in my garden this morning. The same camellias, and climbing rose and fig tree that drops its fruit with its August enthusiasm. And the light is coming through the east window the way it does, and I have my coffee. And I'm trying to find the words for what is different now. What is different is this. I have a daughter-in-law. not a variable, not a figure in the background of my son's life. A person, complicated and real, who is learning, as we are all always learning, at every age, in every season, how to be in the world with more honesty than fear. Vivian comes to the garden sometimes. She came 3 weeks ago on a Saturday, and we spent 2 hours working side by side, she at the camellias, and I at the rose, talking about almost nothing. Her work, a project she is excited about, a friend of hers who is getting married, and whose wedding Vivian is helping to plan. She asked me, at one point, about the climbing rose, how long it takes to establish, whether it was difficult to maintain. I told her it took years to get it right, that the first seasons you just have to let it grow and see what it wants to do, and only then can you begin to understand how to shape it. She considered this. That sounds like everything, she said. Most things, I agreed. Daniel calls every Sunday, without fail. He has called every Sunday for the past 8 months, and the calls have the quality they had when he was young. Unhurried, specific. The conversations of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's lives, rather than performing interest for the sake of obligation. He tells me things. He asks me things. He told me 2 months ago that he and Vivian are trying to have a child, and he told me first, before he told anyone else, which is the thing that mattered most. Are you excited? I asked. Terrified, he said. And yes, that's the correct proportion. He laughed. Then, Mom? Yes. I'm sorry it took so long. For me too, I should have addressed things sooner. I knew what was happening, and I let it go on too long. You did, I said. And you corrected it. I should have done it before you had to. Yes, I agreed. You should have. I paused. But you did it. That counts. Does it? Enormously, I said. The doing counts enormously, Daniel. The timing improves with practice. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear the apartment around him, the particular sounds of a Sunday morning in Brookhaven, something being made in the kitchen, music somewhere. She's really trying, he said. Vivian, she's really, genuinely trying. I know, I said. I see it. I think she didn't know how to have you in her life. She didn't have a template for it. Her mother is very contained. Her relationship with her mother is very formal and very careful. She didn't know what to do with someone like you. Someone like me, I repeated. Someone who... You take up real space, Mom. You always have. Even when you're being quiet about it, you take up real space. I thought about this. About the 31 years of building something carefully and without noise, of choosing invisibility as a professional strategy, of sitting in the third row and not saying anything, whether that was taking up real space or something closer to its opposite. I am learning, I said slowly, to let the space I take up be visible. I know, Daniel said. I've noticed. Is it all right? Mom. His voice was warm and full. It's more than all right. Tom Ashworth and I have had 3 dinners since June. They are not comfortable dinners, exactly. Tom and I are not people who find comfort in each other's company, and I don't think we ever will be. But they are honest dinners. He asks me real questions, and I give him real answers. He has told me, at the second and third dinners, respectively, that I am the most interesting person he has not understood for the longest period of time, and I have told him that the solution to not understanding someone is to ask them questions earlier. He has acknowledged the justice of this. Carol and I have a separate relationship that has nothing to do with the men in our families or the business arrangements that connect us. We have had lunch twice, just the 2 of us, at a small Italian restaurant she chose near her house. The first lunch we talked about practical things. The second lunch she told me about the years her children were young, and I told her about Robert, and we talked about what it is to build a life alongside someone, and then to carry what remains of it alone. She cried a little, and I didn't, and neither of us was performing for the other. I like Carol Ashworth. I think I may have always liked her, if I had troubled myself to look. The Hargrove estate is under new management as of September. The new arrangement is working well. Patricia, the events coordinator, called to tell me that the transition had been handled smoothly and that the estate's calendar was full through the following spring. She did not know who I was until the transition. She knew only that the entity that held the master lease had engaged in a review and restructured the arrangement. When she learned, she called to introduce herself properly. "Mrs. Lin," she said. "I had no idea." "Most people don't," I said. "That has generally been fine with me." "Is it still fine with you?" I thought about this, about the letters, the documentation, the Wednesday morning in my office with Tom Ashworth looking at the city through my window, about Vivian and her lemon cake, about Daniel calling every Sunday, about the garden in the morning light. "Less so," I said. "I find I am less interested in invisibility than I used to be." Patricia laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that recognizes something true. "Well," she said, "you're very welcome to be visible." "We'd be honored." And the Peachtree development broke ground in October. Tom sent me a photograph from the groundbreaking ceremony, a text, somewhat unexpectedly, with a picture of the construction site and the caption, "Couldn't have happened without the adjacent parcel." "Thank you." I looked at the photograph for a moment, at the turned earth and the machinery and the space where something was about to be built, and I texted back, "Build something good." He texted back 3 words, "I intend to." There is a version of this story in which I am the victor, and Vivian is the villain, and Tom is the man who got his comeuppance, and Daniel is the son who learned his lesson, and everything resolves into the clean satisfaction of a wrong made right and a hierarchy properly restored. That is not the story I am telling. The story I am telling is about what happens when a woman decides to stop being invisible. Not as an act of revenge. Revenge is for people who have no other tools, but as an act of clarity, of honesty, of the particular dignity that says, "I have been here all along. I have been building something real all along. And I will no longer arrange myself in the background of a picture that was made without accounting for me." I spent 67 years becoming who I am. I spent 2 years allowing a young woman's fear and a proud man's assumptions to reduce me to a category. I spent 14 months watching what happened when I refused to be reduced any further. What happened was not a catastrophe. So what happened was a correction. Robert would have found all of this very funny. This is the thing I have thought about most, in the quiet mornings with my coffee and the light coming through the east window. He would have found the whole situation, the arm, the seat assignment, Tom Ashworth revising his worldview at 70 miles per hour, genuinely, deeply funny. He would have laughed in the particular way he had, the silent kind, the kind that shook his shoulders and required a moment to recover from. And then he would have asked me what I was going to do about it. And when I told him, he would have nodded and said, "Of course you are." He believed in me with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had been paying close attention for 26 years. He knew what I had built. He knew why I kept it quiet. And he would have known, as clearly as I knew it, that the time for quiet had ended. I tell him things still. Not literally. I'm not a woman who believes in those conversations. Not exactly. But I tell him things in the way that people who have loved someone for a long time keep telling them after they're gone, in the internal voice that has permanently assumed the shape of theirs. I told him about the lemon cake. I told him about Daniel calling every Sunday. I told him that his son is happy, genuinely happy, and that the woman he married is growing into someone I am beginning, slowly and carefully, to know. I told him that I think it is going to be all right. This morning, Vivian called me. Not Daniel, Vivian. She called at 9:15, which is when she knows I am in the garden, and she asked if she could come by on Saturday. She has a question about the rose, she said. It has started behaving strangely, and she looked it up, and she thinks she might know what's wrong with it, but she wants to ask me before she does anything. I said yes. Come Saturday. Bring the lemon cake if you want to practice it again. She laughed. Her real laugh. The one that is slightly too loud. The one that Daniel says she has always been embarrassed about, but that I find I like enormously. She said she would practice it again. She said it was getting better each time. I believe her. The garden is full of light this morning. The fig tree is threatening to drop fruit on schedule. The mockingbird is doing its borrowed song in the camellias. The climbing rose is perhaps behaving strangely, but it is also, underneath the strange behavior, very much alive. The way roses are, when you give them enough time and enough attention and refuse to cut them back before you understand what they are trying to do. I finished my coffee. I put down my cup. I picked up my pruning shears, and I went to tend what I have built. And thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated. And we tell those stories here.